there are a couple things I want to say before I introduce our first panel. First of all, and I've said this many times before, but I truly believe it, there are no two neighbors anywhere in the world that would not trade their problems for our problems. The situation is pretty darn good. And the second thing I want to say, and this is in response to a point that was raised both by Evan and by Ian, and they talked about hopefully this will not be the high watermark in the relationship between our two countries. And I am not worried about that as I look out at the people in this room, quite frankly, leaders in the business community, leaders in government, leaders in the not-for-profit sector, Americans, Canadians. The fact that you're all here on a Tuesday to examine and to think about and to try to make the relationship between our two countries better, I think says more about that relationship than anything I could say. But just because the relationship is very good doesn't mean that it can't be made better. And there are no two people who can probably tell us more about that than our first panelists here today. For the last 3 years, Kirsten Hillman has been the Canadian ambassador to the United States. Before that, she was the deputy ambassador in Washington, and she has over the years held many government positions in Canada, including the responsibility for negotiating Canadian trade agreements. Many of you know that she was absolutely critical in the role in negotiating the modernization of NAFTA, sometimes under exceedingly difficult circumstances. Her colleague today, David Cohn, has the best job in the United States government. He is, at least I think so. He is the United States ambassador to Canada. I will simply tell you, years ago, President Obama came to Canada, one of his trips, and I'm meeting him down at the bottom of the steps. And he says to me, "So how's it going?" And I said, "Well, Mr. President, I think I've got the best job in the United States government." And he kind of looks at me and says, "You want to trade?" It's true story. Anyway, before David came to Ottawa, Ambassador Cohn came to Ottawa, he held several senior roles at Comcast. Before that, he was the chief of staff to Ed Rendell, who was the mayor of Philadelphia, Cheesesteak City. And he has had a very successful career as a lawyer. And finally, if I can turn matters over to the moderator for this discussion, somebody that I think most of the people in this room know, the anchor at BNN Bloomberg, and my friend Amanda Lang. Amanda?
Thank you very much for that. And I should note that although being an ambassador may be the best job, and I'm sure awfully fun, and I know that accommodations are good, it's hard to hear Trump jokes when you're the US ambassador. So probably Ambassador Cohn was the only person in the room not laughing at the thought of a president indicted. Not because he doesn't want to, I don't imagine.
It's easier to hear Trump jokes when he's no longer the president.
Fair enough. But let's keep them to a minimum while he's, at least visible and mic'd up. Thank you very much for being here. I actually want to start with, we've heard a couple of times this reference to this being a high watermark in the relationship between our two countries. And I must say, I want to challenge that a little bit. I think we're very far from a high watermark. There's no fear of this being it. I think it was probably, possibly when Reagan was in the White House. We can differ on when it was, but it doesn't feel like now's the time. I'd like both of you to reflect on the relationship. Where do you think it stands today?
Would you like me to start?
Sure.
Okay. Well, I think the first thing I would say is that when we tend to look back in history, there is a bit of a rose-colored glasses effect almost always. So I think it's very difficult to compare today with the geopolitics of today, with the economic environment of today, with the post-COVID Russia invasion, democracies under threat today, with a different world. So I don't know if it's even that useful. I think that what's useful is to say, are we doing the best that we can? What more can we do? And how best do we face the day together? And in that regard, I think we're doing well, and I think we have enormous future potential. And I think the potential is driven by the fact that, for the same reason the summit is being held, we are all acutely aware in both countries that we have something very special here that we are likely not leveraging to the greatest extent possible. In government, in the private sector, in academia, our scientists, everyone. It is incredible, but we do take each other for granted, frankly, more than we should.
Ambassador Cohen, since Ambassador Hillman rejects the premise of the question, I'll let you reframe it a little bit as well. Are we doing the best we can with our potential?
So Amanda, I get to work with Kirsten every day, and I just met you an hour ago. So given the choice, I'm going to take Kirsten's side in every opportunity.
It's probably wise.
But I actually agree completely with what she said. And when you were framing the question, I was thinking, and I'll translate this to Canadian terms, of attempts to compare a current day hockey team to other teams in hockey history. The game was different, the geopolitical environment being different. It's really hard to compare situations over long periods of time. And I'm not even sure I'd be qualified to do that. I mean, I pay attention to international affairs and geopolitics, but I really only have a 16-month intensive lens on this relationship. And I will say that I'm not sure how important it is to compare the relationship to the way it's been in perpetuity. I will say, and I've given a lot of thought to this, I would have said this before the president's visit, I say it after the president's visit, but the state of the relationship is excellent. It doesn't mean that it's perfect. It doesn't mean that there isn't more work to be done, but the foundation has been laid to do all the work that needs to be done. And I think we have, the way I'd assess it, is I think we have a relationship that is the envy of basically every other country in the world. Every other country in the world would trade our relationship with their most important ally in a heartbeat.
Certainly, from the U.S. point of view, I think that's safe to say. I want to talk about what may be one of the existential threats, and it's something that, Ian Bremmer and G0 have been talking about and writing about and thinking about for years, and that is, of course, the shift away from globalization. And it's characterized in many different ways, and you come across, I know from experience, as somewhat whiny if you say this is not a good trend, it's not good to actually retrench and think anything but that freer trade is better trade. But this seems to be the world that we're living in. So in that context, I actually want both of you, to the extent that you can in your current roles, but I mean, Ambassador Hillman, I know you have feelings and thoughts about this given the extent to which you've worked on these agreements. How do we negotiate a world where globalization is suddenly not the optimal solution, where freer trade and open borders is not what everybody thinks is the right goal?
So I think that it's challenging in these conversations if we don't have a common understanding of the terms that we're using. And so some people talk about deglobalization, about really like ripping the global network, economic network apart. I don't think that's what's happening. And I don't think that is going to happen anytime soon because it's too deeply entrenched. I think what is happening is a strategic realignment in specific sectors in order to deal with particular vulnerabilities that we have started to understand and unravel a bit of sort of willful blindness, I think, that we have had around how certain kinds of economic security and national security and defense security rely on a certain amount of either independence or dependence on countries that we can really count on when the chips are down. And we have all we had an awakening through COVID and most certainly, emphasized through the Russian invasion of Ukraine about how far we had become vulnerable to very specific strategic vulnerabilities. So that's what's happening. This concept that I think was initially coined by Janet Yellen of friendshoring, that's what's happening. And we'll see how far it goes. And I think one of the things that I talk about a lot is excellent idea, understandable, probably smart for us as partners and as like-minded, security and defense partners, but it's lacking definition. And the definition is going to be crucial. And I think we've started down that road with the Americans, and I think that's a really important role. Like, who is a friend? Why are they a friend? What are they a friend for? What is this moment of friendship mean, both economically and from a security perspective?
Ambassador Cohen?
I do think definitions are important here. And I also think this is either for good or for bad. This is one of those issues that, at least in the United States, can be heavily influenced by who the president is and by the president's philosophy around what does the president want to see as the relationship between the United States and the rest of the world. In this president, we have a president who believes in the importance of global alliances, of the role of the United States in helping to create those alliances, sometimes lead those alliances, sometimes encourage other countries to lead those alliances when they are better placed. And I think in the 2 years of the Biden administration, there are so many examples of the opposite of a retrenchment from globalization. And I'd take the battle against Russia as a result of Ukraine as one of the great historical examples of that. I mean, in fact, the world's democracies, 70 countries, have banded together to take on Russia, to punish Russia, to criticize Russia for its illegal and horrific invasion of Ukraine. And I can't think of a recent example. You'd have to go back to World War II to see an alliance of countries working outside of their own individual interests and working together. And I'm very sensitive to the fact that in any room on the international stage, there's a risk that the United States could be perceived as the 800-pound gorilla, and what the United States says goes. One of the reasons I'm so proud of Joe Biden is that he understands that, and he's gone out of his way to make sure that other countries, and in particular Canada, are given an opportunity to lead if they are comfortable doing so. And so you can take the sanctions against Russia, where Canada played a leading role, the leading role, on putting together the coalition on sanctions against banks. You can take arbitrary detention, where Canada played the leading role in the world in assembling a coalition and a declaration against arbitrary detention. Both of those are not insular activities. They are our countries spreading our wings and looking at the world as a global place. They're both also outside of the trade context, which for me definitionally is important because globalization is important for a lot more than just trade. So I think culturally and philosophically, the United States is I'm going to call it a high watermark, but under Joe Biden's leadership is very much interested in making sure that the United States and like-minded allies are approaching global issues in the world, not in an insular fashion, but more globally.
Fair enough. One could argue, we won't hear with 13 minutes left, that it's a real dismantling of the Bretton Woods organizations, or the mentality to say we will think globally, geopolitically, politically, but economically we will not. It's a real reversal.
I don't think we are thinking that economically. I was just saying
Let's get to the Inflation Reduction Act then.
I don't think we are thinking that economically, but I would also say, and Kirsten said this right, which is Bretton Woods was a completely different time, completely different environment. You can't lock your external factors in place from 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Absolutely.
And say, okay, we're going to still behave in the way that the world existed in that time. As the world changes, we all have to change in our responses and in our approach to dealing with each other.
When we think of the Inflation Reduction Act, it is obviously one that Canada, I think Ambassador Hillman has come to see as a necessary evil we will try to exploit to our advantage. But it's not one that we would have chosen, obviously. And just in the last day or so, a minister of the Crown speaking to a UK newspaper said, you know, this amounts to kind of an issue for us on trade. I won't name him because I think he probably didn't mean to be taken that way, and I'm sure he's in trouble with his prime minister. But we don't love it for good reason. Now we're saying, okay, this is the framework. How can we not be hurt by this? It doesn't feel like the best way to be operating.
So, want me to go first on this one? I'll give you the second word. So I can't disagree with you that there are many people in Canada who don't love the Inflation Reduction Act. But I think, to be fair, there are also not many people in Canada who fully understand the Inflation Reduction Act. It's new. The regulations are still being issued. From a United States perspective, it was necessary in order for us to achieve our climate-related goals in the United States. It was never meant to be the final word. It is not protectionist in any way. There are Canadian companies, by way of example, are eligible for much of the funding that exists under the Inflation Reduction Act. The opportunities, look, the single largest exception to the Buy American provisions that Canada was seeking is embedded in the Inflation Reduction Act, and that's the electric vehicle tax credit, which is now a North American provision. And like many other federal procurement rules and regulations floating around, Canada and the United States are involved in continuous negotiations to make sure that the reach of the act with respect to Canada and North America is as fair and as equitable as possible, while enabling the president to achieve his objectives in passing the act. So I think everyone's going to have to reserve judgment on just how impactful and effective this act is. I don't think it's the disaster that some people fear. I do think, and if you, by the way, just look at the joint statement with respect to the visit, and you see funding commitments to Canadian companies under the Inflation Reduction Act and related programs like the CHIPS Act and the Defense Production Act to Canadian companies. I think in the end, if the Inflation Reduction Act works, I think Canada will be a significant beneficiary of the business and the activity that is stimulated under that act.
You, sir, are very good at your job.
I'll take that not as a compliment.
Take it as you must. Ambassador Hillman, it's not protectionist at all.
So I'm going to take a step back because the challenge almost always when we are looking at the Canada-US relationship in the economic space, in the regulatory space, almost in any sector, is that we are deeply aligned, deeply integrated, and we have very different political systems. In terms of legislative, I don't mean politics, I mean legislative systems. And that leads to challenges when we are trying to have things run smoothly. And this is a good example. So Canada, since 2015, has been implementing a lot of different policies in order to incentivize clean growth, energy transition, electrification. The cornerstone of our policy is a price on carbon, because we can pass a price on carbon. The United States is not passing a price on carbon, probably anytime soon. Senator Coons can speak to that, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. So the administration, with a very strong agenda with respect to energy transition, clean growth, incentivizing this sector of their economy, only had certain tools at their disposal, and they were different tools than we had at our disposal. Furthermore, they're 10 times our size with an enormous purse. And you put those things together and you end up with the Inflation Reduction Act, right? Which puts us in a position that is reactionary in certain respects. Not completely, because as I say, we've been laying the groundwork for that and created a market in Canada and created, and I think thankfully we had, because if we hadn't gone down that far down that road already, and we were faced with this particular program in 2015 or 14 or 13, we would be, I think, in a much different position. But we have a fairly sophisticated understanding in Canada about what our value proposition is in this area of the economy. And it's regulatory, and it has to do, frankly, with our natural endowments, and it has to do with the expertise that we've developed in this area over the years. We have some of the most interesting innovations across the entire energy sector, from fossils to electric to nuclear to, right, all of it. We have the bounty of clean hydro. So we weren't starting from zero. And then, though, and I would say, of course it required a certain reaction from Canada in order to ensure our competitiveness. Absolutely, the vehicle tax credit, carbon for United States and Canada, for the minerals and the battery production and the vehicle assembly is incredible, and frankly, I think it is going to secure the future of our industry and the most, hopefully, really incentivize enormous innovation. So it's fantastic. But we have to make sure that that happens in the rest of the fields that are covered by these policies. And that's what the budget did last week, or is trying to do. And I think that it's never static. So certain policies were adopted. As David said, the US policies will be implemented. We will take very good note of how that happens, and we will adapt. We'll adapt in a way that keeps us integrated. And I guess the final point I would say, and this will sound like a diplomat talking, but it happens to be true. Most of what we say is true. This happens to be absolutely true. The leaders do have these very honest conversations that people have been encouraging us to have over the course of this day. They don't always have them in public, they don't always talk about them in public, but they have them and they have them in an important way. And it's about how we can't not be aligned at this moment, that our climate policy is our energy policy, that our energy policy is our national security policy, that our national security policy is wound up in the effects of climate change around the world, but in particular in our region, and then all of that underpins our economy. And therefore, we've got to be kind of figuring out this together. It's a bit bumpy. We have different tools, as I said, but we will get there because we have to, because it's the right thing to do, and we both need to.
We've only got a few minutes left. Ambassador Cohen, obviously the leader-to-leader level is important symbolically, and things, as you say, Ambassador Hillman, can be done at that level. It sets a tone, the relationship matters. But from your point of view, where is the most important work that you will do over the term of your tenure? Is it at that level? Is it state to province? What's the kind of level at which you think in terms of the nitty-gritty of this relationship?
So, look, the leaders' relationship means everything in this relationship. And it's funny, at dinner last night, we were talking about the continued importance of relationships in banking, and that the great banks still do rely on important relationships with clients. Well, I think geopolitically and in foreign affairs and international diplomacy, the relationship between your leaders really matter. Mm-hmm. And if there's anything that you should have seen from the visit last week, it is the genuine affection and closeness of the relationship between the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Canada. And as long as that exists, there's sort of nothing that's out of our reach. And that message, by the way, if everyone in this room didn't see it, our cabinet saw it, the Canadian cabinet saw it, everyone working in this space saw that the leaders want us to be working together. And I think that's where the most important work is done. It's done at the cabinet level, cabinet to cabinet, minister to cabinet, what we would call the high-level working group. And by the way, those relationships are excellent too. so that there are all of these deep, respectful relationships where we can talk to each other about literally any issue. And don't take this the wrong way, without your reading about it in the newspaper the next day. We can bring up anything and have a confidential discussion, and what do you know? Most of those issues end up getting resolved before they are publicly exposed. And I think that is the hallmark of this relationship, and it's where most of the work will be done to take us to the next level.
Ambassador?
So I agree with what David says around the high-level relationships, and I do think that we are in a moment in time where we have two leaders that have a very strong, not only affection for each other, but a sincere alignment in their policies, and really believe in the same things, and that the same things need to happen right now, and that flows down through their cabinets. And I think it is essential that we seize this moment and that we do the most with it while it exists, because when our country's leadership isn't aligned, it's not like we don't get things done, but it's like there could be an opportunity right now to supercharge some activities. And you'll see that we have set 1 year and 2 year goals for ourselves, and that's, I think, an indication of our interest in moving things along quickly. But I would add to that, and this picks up on some of the comments that were made by Ian and Daryl in the first two sessions, is I actually believe that it's really important for us to start giving certain aspects of our relationship deeper roots, deeper entwinements, deeper entanglements, stronger commitments, stronger relationships that are hard to rip apart, because times change. And we saw in the NAFTA, when things were really challenging for the renegotiation, what we were able to do was to turn to members of our two countries, whether it was the business community or whether it was local communities, local lawmakers, some academics, our military relationships, and use those to support what it is we were trying to do within each country. So instead of necessarily always going directly to the source that you were trying to negotiate with, you go to the people that they're listening to, right? And it was essential that those relationships were strong and that we had allies in both directions across a variety of communities in our country. So I actually think that we really need to be working that through, figuring out what we want to do with those relationships and making sure that we strengthen them as much as possible.
We are at time, but I must ask, what would those deeper roots look like? What's on the agenda?
I think that it's joint economic projects. I think that it's doing things together whereby it is so much to our advantage to do them together and kind of expensive to rip them apart, to be frank. I think that it is doing joint research, joint development, joint technology. I think our unions are probably, we have 24 binational unions in our two countries. I don't think any other Canada has any binational unions with any other country, and I'm pretty sure the US doesn't either. That's an interesting group of individuals that I'm not sure we really call upon as much as we could or should. And actually just citizens who live back and forth, who invest in each other's communities, that makes a difference. When push comes to shove, the way in which political decision-making affects individual people's lives and livelihoods and the way they live their lives has more power than almost anything, in my experience.
We are unfortunately at time, so we're going to leave it there, but please join me in a warm thank you to Ambassador Hillman and Ambassador Cardin. Thank you both.
Thanks, Amanda.